This is a primer in the demand control schema. This is to be used by interpreters unfamiliar with this framework in order to provide context for further learning. At the end of this presentation, you will be able to define demand control schema in important terms, categorize the types of demands and controls, and apply the schema to real-life examples. Before launching directly into the terminology, it is important to establish an overarching, consistent thought. Demands are about the job. Controls are about the interpreter. Let's begin with some definitions. A demand is a factor that rises to a level of significance that will or should impact the decision-making involved in your work. Demands are items in the environment or things in the interpreting environment that will require a response in some form. There are 4 categories of demands. Environmental, which are demands that are specific to the setting and the environment. Interpersonal, which are demands that are specific to the interaction of the customers and the interpreter. Paralinguistic, which are demands that are specific to the quality of the consumer's expressive language. And intrapersonal, which are demands that are specific to the interpreter. These are also commonly called the EIPI. Environmental demands set the stage for what is about to happen. This is broken down even further into 4 subcategories: the goal of the environment, the physical surroundings, the personnel or clientele, and specialized terminology. Environmental demands are already there or in place before people begin interacting with each other. For a simple comparison, think of the movie set. We have the characters, their memorized lines, scenery, and props all ready to go. In other words, the environmental demands are the where, who, and why of an appointment. Before anything happens in the environment, consider the physical things and circumstances that are currently at play in the environment. Those are your environmental demands. Interpersonal demands are any interaction between 2 different people. These interactions can include power dynamics, communication style, communication goals, emotional tone, and thought worlds. Interpersonal demands will be the majority of the demands that an interpreter encounters in an appointment. Think again about the environmental demands. If the environmental demands are the where, who, and why, the interpersonal demands are the what or the what happens of the situation. This is when the director has yelled, "Action!" and the participants begin to interact with one another. Finally, interpersonal demands are the most complex of the demands. Here is where we, as cultural mediators between 2 parties, frequently coming from 2 different worlds and styles of communication, are called into action. Paralinguistic demands are factors that affect the perceptual quality of a message. The prefix para means around or surrounding, so paralinguistic demands are the packaging that the message comes in. They aren't the what is being said, but rather the how it is being said. This can include the volume of speech, either whispering or shouting, atypical pacing, really quickly or really slowly, accents, physical positioning, or physical or cognitive limitations. This doesn't mean that the interpreter does not understand the content of the appointment. That would fall under an environmental demand, particularly related to terminology. This is the "what did you say?" rather than "what does that mean?" Intrapersonal demands are the internal experiences of you, the interpreter. These can include feelings of fatigue, feeling of hunger, persistent thoughts about one's own interpreting performance, or any persistent thought or feeling that interrupts your interpretation. It is important to recognize how thoughts and our feelings about an assignment may have an impact on how we interact or facilitate an interpretation. Being self-aware of what arises in our own thought worlds can help one best mitigate and choose how to respond. Frequently, intrapersonal demands are confused with controls. Again, think about it this way. Demands require something from the worker. The controls are the abilities or the capacity of that worker to meet or respond to the demand. We'll talk more about controls momentarily. So, to recap, there are four types of categories of demands. Four types or categories of demands. EIPI, environmental, interpersonal, paralinguistic, and intrapersonal. Controls are how the interpreter interacts with and responds to the demands of an interpreting assignment. Simply put, a control is how the interpreter responds to a demand. Controls are best understood as nouns and not verbs. They are resources an interpreter has at their disposal. Every aspect of the interpreter is potentially a relevant control, including their knowledge, character attributes, and even attitudes. Sometimes it is helpful to think of these as control options or control resources. Controls are employed at three different times of an assignment. Pre-assignment controls are controls that the interpreter brings to the setting or things that one does to prepare for an assignment. A pre-assignment control can simply be who you are. It can also be what you do in order to prepare for the assignment. Assignment controls are actions that you choose to take or actions you choose not to take, and your language decisions during an assignment. And finally, post-assignment controls are employed after the assignment is concluded. Example of these may include following up with the customer, following up with the client, doing further research into the topic, debriefing or venting, and other means of self-care. Each interpreter will have their own set of control resources or responses. There is rarely one right or wrong control choice. Rather, there is a spectrum of control choices ranging from liberal to conservative. And no, I don't mean that in the political sense. Liberal or conservative decisions are not better or worse than any other. They are just different. Liberal control choices in this context means favoring action versus conservative control choices, which means favoring inaction. For example, if you can't hear the speaker, a few liberal controls may be to ask the speaker to repeat what they said, ask the person next to you what they said, or move closer to the speaker. Conservative controls for the same demand would be to use closure skills to piece together what may have been said, omit what has been said, and or apologize and inform the client that you cannot hear the speaker. Now, you know what the demands are and you know what the controls are. Are you ready to employ the DCS? Not exactly. Before moving on to discuss how these all fit together in order to analyze interpreting, we need to introduce a couple of more topics. Remember how you'd ask your teacher what you thought was a pretty straightforward question and they'd respond, "It depends." Well, we are going to introduce the reasons why it depends. Namely, being a practiced profession, interpreters work with a variety of people in a variety of settings. Demands and their controls are not one size fits all. Demands do not exist in a vacuum. Frequently, many demands are in play simultaneously. Demand constellations are made up of two parts: main demands and concurrent demands. The main demand is the central demand requiring a control option. Typically, these are from interpersonal demand category. Main demands are the what happened or what was said. Concurrent demands are factors or demands happening simultaneously that impact your control choice to the first or main demand. These tend to be from environmental, interpersonal, or other paralinguistic categories. Concurrent demands are the context requiring assessment before an effective control choice is made. Every decision in life has consequences. Responses to demands, or the controls you employ, are just the same. In this light, positive and negative consequences do not mean simply that one is good or one is bad. It is more closely related to positive being in the presence of, and negative meaning the absence of. Furthermore, it is common that there are more than one positive and negative consequence for each control choice. Again, positive consequences are the intended effect, or the notion of what is gained by this choice. Negative consequences are the unintended effect, or what is forfeited by this choice. All consequences are immediately revealed. They are directly correlated to the control responding to the constellation of demands, and they are not theoretical, meaning that they are frequently observable. A resolution is the successful conclusion to a demand-control pairing. This tends to be the result of a positive consequence, or what was intended. A resulting demand requires additional controls and tends to be the result of a negative consequence, or what was unintended or forfeited. We have all the pieces of the puzzle, so let's put them together. This is where the framework comes together to aid in making the appropriate ethical decisions necessary in an interpretation. First, a demand constellation is identified. Then, a control choice is made. This control will have a positive and negative consequence, or many positive and negative consequences that may lead to resolution or a resulting demand. Using the DCCRD, let's see how the same demand in two different observation settings can result in different controls with different consequences. Before discussing the main demand, let's briefly look at our settings. The first is an educational setting of an elementary art class. And the goal of this setting is to educate. The participants are one art teacher, two teacher's aides, and 4 students. The terminology of the day is related to clay and related to classroom management. The location is a typical art classroom with work tables, a sink in the corner, and other art supplies around the room. Our second observation setting is an employment setting of an all-staff training. Again, the goal is to educate. However, there are more participants. In this case, there are nearly 30 teachers, all ranging from the early 20s to the late 50s, and are primarily white. The lead presenter is a middle-aged white female. The terminology is related to processes, classroom management, and, specifically in this training, meetings. This meeting takes place in a school all-purpose room. The main demand, can't hear the speaker. I'm going to stick with this demand that we have previously discussed. This is an attempt to show how a control can be employed given the context of a situation. Let's start by identifying the constellation of demands in each setting. The main demand is, I can't hear the speaker. In the educational setting, a concurrent demand is, the students are talking as they work. The art teacher is giving instructions about the next step of the project. The art teacher is also walking from station to station as he talks. A control choice I would employ is, I would say, Mr. In, I missed that last piece of instruction. Conversely, in the employment setting, let's look at the concurrent demands. The presenter has just initiated a new portion of the training. There is a large projection screen with a PowerPoint for everyone to see. The presenter has moved on to her next utterance or her next sentence. Here, my control choice is to look at the PowerPoint and use closure skills with what I see and what I heard. So why these controls? Well, of course, there's more context. The control choice for the elementary classroom is, Mr. N, I missed that last piece of instruction. This is a fairly liberal, although moderately liberal choice. In the other example, the control choice is to look at the PowerPoint and use closure skills, which is fairly conservative, leaning towards the side of inaction. This is also a result of the familiarity of the environment and the expected role the interpreter is to play in that environment. That could, I guess, be considered another concurrent demand. Llewellyn-Jones and Lee, in their publication Redefining the Role of the Community Interpreter, the concept of role space, present the notion of presentation of self. They say that interpreters need to behave in ways that are consonant with, rather than counter to, expectations of the participants. By acting in ways that are similar to the other participants, interpreters can be more effective in facilitating successful interactions. These also played into my control choice. The students were talking in the art classroom, so it's natural that I also talk to make my point known that I missed the instruction. I couldn't hear what was said. Conversely, the other participants of the training were not talking. It would not match their behaviors for me as the interpreter to interrupt and ask what was said. Let's look at the positive and negative consequences. One positive consequence is Mr. N is informed that a student is missing his instruction. Negative consequence, Mr. N turns away from the other students to face me, the interpreter, directly. The resulting demand, all of the attention in the classroom, is turned toward the student and their need for an interpreter. In the employment setting, the control is to look at the PowerPoint and use closure skills. Positive consequence, the presentation is allowed to continue without interruption, or it saves time. Negative consequence, the details of the transition joke are omitted from the interpretation. My client, noticing that the other participants are chuckling around them, asks, "What's funny?" Ultimately, the demand control schema is a framework for talking about, analyzing, and comprehending the work of an interpreter. So why use the demand control schema and the DCCRD? Through analyzing and discussing your experiences and those of your colleagues, you will begin to distinguish which resulting demands are probable versus merely possible, and to put the most of our attention and energy towards considering probable resulting demands. In short, by using the DCS, we will become more effective, more efficient interpreters.